is Dr. Brian Morrow, and I have the honor of serving as Florham Campus Executive for you. I want to welcome everyone here this evening. Tonight we have a very special guest. Ramu Damodaran is Deputy Director of Partnerships and Public Engagement in the UN Department of Public Information's Outreach Division and Chief of the UN Academic Inpact Initiative. That's a mouthful. I want to see that on a business card. Damodaran is responsible for outreach to and partnerships with non-governmental, academic, and private sector constituencies, as well as the general public. His division is responsible for a variety of outreach programs, publishes the UN Chronicle magazine and the Yearbook of the United Nations. In addition, it organizes special observances and events. Damodaran previously served in departments of peacekeeping and special political questions and in the executive office of the UN Secretary General. He is a member of the Indian Foreign Service and has served in the Indian diplomatic missions in Moscow and in the United Nations. Today, he will be speaking with us about the United Nations academic impact. It's informed by a commitment to support and advance 10 basic principles: addressing poverty, capacity building, education for all, global citizenship, access to higher education, human rights, intercultural dialogue, peace and conflict resolution, sustainability, and the United Nations Charter. UNAI is aided in its work to advance these principles by hubs, UNAI member institutions that focus on a particular principle in their own activities and in cooperation with other members. These 10 principles were first introduced publicly here at Fairleigh Dickinson University at the Florham campus by former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. Today, Ramu Damodaran will be joined in conversation with FDU's own Dr. Jason Sforza, Professor of Political Science and Philosophy and Vice Provost for Academic and International Affairs. Enjoy the program.
Thank you very much, Dr. Morrow. Ramu, we have known each other for, I don't know how many years, since we grew up together in Mumbai. But I've never heard the story of how you came to the UN. I know our students always have an interest in the progress of a person's career. So can you start from the beginning and tell us a little bit about how you came to be a card-carrying member of the United Nations Mafia?
Thanks, Jason. Strangely enough, I think all began with choosing the right university. Because when I was studying in India, the aspiration of virtually everyone going to college was to join the National Civil Services. You must remember this was a time when India had a fairly regulatory economy. So jobs in business, the corporate sector, industry were very few and often regarded with deep suspicion. The really professional cadres, jobs like doctors, engineers, lawyers, had a system and a recruitment process of their own. And here again, it was really a question of individual talent rather than an organized bureaucracy, if you will. So the one thing that really brought people together was the Indian Civil Service. And I was fortunate to join a course in history at the undergraduate and the postgraduate levels, where the postgraduate degree in history led straight into the exam one would have to do for the civil services. So in other words, if I was studying for my master's, I'd already studied for the civil services as well. Through that process, I joined the Indian Foreign Service, and as Dr. Norm just mentioned, I served in the Indian Embassy in Moscow before coming back to Delhi, and then I was assigned to the Indian mission to the United Nations. And about 3 years after I had begun working at the Indian mission, the United Nations was looking for people to work on a very specific issue. That was the issue of Namibia, a country which we now know as Namibia. At that time, it was known by people who believed in its independence as Namibia, but since it was a colony of South Africa, it was referred to formally as Southwest Africa. And it's a very curious case because it is the only case where the United Nations took on the responsibility for administering a specific territory. Because the membership of the United Nations decided that South Africa's occupation was illegal, there was no one else who could take it on because South Africa would not allow a physical government in place there. And so the organization took it on, and they needed people to man it. What does that mean? In my case, the responsibility they wanted to assign was that of pursuing cases in national and international courts against corporations which sought to exploit the economy of Namibia. So we suddenly had this request for people to join, and I was very keen to join at that point. I had a great advantage because I was not married, and so I could afford to take on a contract for 6 months without any consideration about what happened after that. I didn't have children to send to school or a wife who wanted a job of her own, quite understandably, and so that was probably an unfair advantage. But what this did allow me to do was to move into an intersection of politics, which clearly Namibia was, and the law, because we had to go, for instance, to courts in the Netherlands, because there were Dutch companies working with South Africa to exploit uranium in Namibia. And this was clearly in violation of international law, and they had to be taken to task. And this option, which I exercised, led to what eventually was to become a United Nations career, moving from Namibia once it became free to another area, which is peacekeeping operations, to political affairs, and eventually to where I'm now, the Department of Global Communications.
And your title is Chief
Of the Academic Impact.
of the Academic Impact. Are there many chiefs at the UN?
Far too many, I think. Yes, absolutely. As I was introduced, I think the parent title that they give all of us is Deputy Director, but I think most of us feel it's better to be chief of something small than Deputy Director of something big.
And the UN Academic Impact Program is by no means small.
It's extremely small if you look at the number of people who are actually working on it, which is really 3 halves. There are 3 of us, and for each of us, it's half of our principal responsibility. But it's certainly not small when you consider the number of institutions who've signed on to it and who are in effect working for the academic impact in their own terrain.
Maybe we could start at the beginning and talk a little bit about how the academic impact came to be, because FDU has part of the story. Obviously, you have part of the story, and Secretary General Bond has a big part of the story. Can you give us a little insight into where it all began?
I would love to, and I must say that it's going to be very poignant for me to reflect upon that, because as I mentioned, Jason, when I came in, the last time I was in this room was on June the 29th, 2012, when we had a memorial service for Michael Adams. Looking at the age of most of you, I don't imagine many of you knew him or had seen him personally, but I'm sure you're aware of his vision, the contribution he made not only to this university, but, and I'll say quite candidly, but to the world. And one measure of that was the point where Jason and I first met, which was in the context of the International Association of University Presidents. Michael invited me to join their meeting in Thailand in the year 2005. And we were sitting one evening at dinner, and Michael said, "You've got this wonderful group here of university presidents from all over the world. What can they do for the United Nations? Let's think about it." And I said, "Michael, you are yourself at FDU doing so much. Programs such as this, there were programs of video conferences hosted at FDU, ambassadors coming across the Hudson to events over here, and the idea that Michael always was firm about, living the legacy of Peter Sammartino, the first president of FDU, but the idea that you belong for and of the world, an idea that he wanted to instill in every graduate of FDU, and beyond that to the thinking student community at large." But then we realized that what we were considering was really, if you will, a series of individual excellences. You have FDU, you have a university in Japan, a university in Korea. All of them are motivated. They're led by people who believe in a global cause. What was missing? The idea of bringing them together. Now, certainly we had an association of university presidents, but that was really a unity at the leadership level. What we needed is to engage faculty in believing that no matter what the subject they were teaching or doing research in, it made a difference to the United Nations. I was speaking to Dr. Holzapfel a little while ago, and he mentioned quite correctly that if you go to a faculty of mathematics and say, what is the connection between what you're doing and the United Nations? The answer will be one of puzzlement. People will not make the connection. But yet, if you look at some specific innovations, discoveries, research in the realm of mathematics, and translate that into its practical application, and see how that practical application works for the global good or the common good, you find that right away, because anything that benefits the life of a single child, woman, or man anywhere in the world is contributing to a United Nations goal. So it's not too far-fetched to see how, if people are willing to look at the work they're doing in that prism, then you will have an immense constituency, not of uncritical support. A lot of the people who are involved in this will have their reservations about the United Nations, as indeed many of us who are working with the United Nations have. I mean, that's part of any system or any structure. But the point that we wanted to make is that no matter what your discipline, no matter what your field of specialization, what you do is not cloistered, isolated scholarship alone. It can make a difference to the world. Michael, and after that, Michael and Jason together worked with us in creating the academic impact on these principles. The idea being that you had a set of overarching norms or objectives, and these were the practical steps that one would take to achieve them.
And this was happening at a time when the United Nations was becoming more intentional about not only outreach and engagement with universities, but also outreach and engagement with the private sector and non-governmental organizations. Right. To what extent is the academic impact a mirror image or, shall we say, I hate to use the word doppelganger, to what extent is the academic impact like the Global Compact? To what extent is it not like the Global Compact?
The Global Compact is in many ways a restraint mechanism, because the Global Compact is an association of business corporations, multinational companies, national companies, who agree that in the course of their work, no matter, we all accept that their work is ultimately for profit, whether it's for personal profit or institutional profit or shareholder profit, but in acquiring or in moving to that profit, they will respect safeguards in 4 critical areas: the environment, labor standards, human rights, and a denial of anything that is corrupt or corruption. So in a sense, it's a code of conduct that the companies take to make sure that in the exercise of their functions, they will not violate or infringe upon these 4 core areas. I would like to think that the academic impact almost takes that code of conduct for granted. We don't go to universities saying, you must respect human rights or you must respect the environment. What we ask them to do is to undertake at least one activity every year, and that's a very, very, very modest requirement, which can further a United Nations cause or objective. And one of the reasons why we were so convinced that the academic impact would work was by the time we had got the act together, and by we I mean Jason, Michael, I, and a very distinguished former ambassador of Pakistan to the United Nations, Ambassador Kamal, the 4 of us sat at the UN and worked out the specific points of what was going to become the initiative. The one thing that we realized was that if you go to the website, and at that time, by the time we got to this, virtually every institution had its own website, and look at what a university or a college is doing, you will find something which is relevant to the United Nations. So it's not asking people to do more. It's not asking people to create a new budget or bring in new staff or create a new element in the curriculum. What they're doing already serves the purpose. The only thing is bringing that connection home to students. And frankly, students get it already, because students are, to my mind, and I apologize, I don't intend to sound patronizing, I think students are much more instinctive about realizing the connection of what they're doing or studying for the global good than faculty often are, because faculty, with all respect, tend to be much more engaged in the intellectual, academic and scholastic worth of what they're doing rather than the popular.
And departmental politics. Let's not leave that aside. So how many universities are presently engaged or participating in the academic impact? And can you give us perhaps one or two examples that our students might find particularly inspiring?
Well, we have about 1,300 universities who are members. We've become, in the beginning when we started at the end of 2010, and it was launched jointly by Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, as you said, Jason, and by Michael Adams. And at that point, we were extremely receptive to anyone who wanted to join. We've become a little more circumspect now, because a number of people do want to join because they want to use the United Nations name, and they may not actually be credible institutions. So there's some measure of a background check and verification to make sure that they are credible institutions and will serve us well. I was, in November, just a few months ago, I was invited to a meeting of 32 members of the academic impact in Kerala in South India, which actually happens to be the part of India that I'm from. And I was astonished to see how within a space of 3 months, and I mention this particularly because in August last year, August 2018, we had devastating floods in the state of Kerala, which completely crippled the state economy, had a number of people left homeless, but above all, caused devastation to one of the most major industries or occupations in Kerala, that is fishing. Because of the floods, fishermen were unable to go out into the sea. Fish stocks had moved away from the shoreline, and so that entire industry, in effect, collapsed over a period of several weeks. Coincidentally, this was exactly the time that these universities and colleges were planning to join the academic impact. And they got together towards the end of September saying, we are now members of this and we have a situation here at hand. What do we do? So they brought in experts from faculties of 15 or 16 colleges, different faculties, with one objective: create low-cost housing for the fisherman community, which the fisherman could buy for himself or herself and the family at a price that they could afford, and make that house environmentally sustainable, A, B, proximate to where the fishing stocks were, the marine resources across the shoreline, and C, be accessible for everyone, including those who were injured in the floods and were either on crutches or a wheelchair. They were able to construct these houses within a period, the first few houses, within a period of 9 weeks. These were houses built on stilts so that they were not susceptible to, they would move with the earth if there were to be an earthquake, which sometimes happens in that part of the world. An innovation which students of engineering at one college brought in from Japan. They were able to create a pathway from the shoreline to the houses so that people who required physical assistance or motorized assistance in order to get from one point to the other were able to navigate it without having to climb through difficult terrain. All this was done by students led by their faculty, and what was most astonishing was that each of these houses was priced at 400,000 Indian rupees, which is, I would say, probably less than $8,000 or so. And banks were willing to give the loan to people who did not have that. They bought it. And I'm not assuming credit for the academic impact for this, because I have a feeling that the emergency of what happened in Kerala would have spurred this on. But it happened, and it was a wonderful platform for which, on which it was engaged. So that's one story. At the other end of the spectrum is another story I'd like to tell you from nearer home, where we had a member of the academic impact, the University of California. There we had a situation where there was a young student who was, I think, about 18 or 19. He used to visit his grandmother every weekend, and he found that his grandmother's eyesight was failing. And he wanted to do something for her. So he asked her what he could do, and she said, look, I'm reconciled to the fact that my eyesight will fail. I'll tell you the one thing I miss. It's not so much not being able to read, because I can listen, but I make myself a cup of tea at 11 o'clock every morning. When I put the tea bag into the mug and I pour the hot water, I'm not ever sure whether it's reached the rim of the cup. And in the process, hot water spills over. Sometimes it burns me. It always creates a mess on the counter. That is the one thing I miss. And this student went back to the university, got together some friends and began thinking about this. Working together, they developed a mug where there was a little sensor placed about an inch below the rim. So the moment the water reached that level, it beeped. And his grandmother knew this far and no further. So that's another instance of what imagination, scholarship, ingenuity can do. And you will not immediately, if I told you the story, you're not immediately likely to think, oh, this is a discovery for the United Nations. But what is the United Nations about? We have a convention on the rights of people with disabilities. We're looking for practical solutions for people who are faced with physical challenges because of disability. Each innovation, each discovery, each sense of wonder which comes out through that process makes a difference and is something which is relevant to us. And so these two extreme examples, if you will, Jason, I think make it all worthwhile.
Thank you very much. I've observed that within the United Nations in general, apart from the academic impact and perhaps one or two other areas, universities are kind of seen with some puzzlement. We're seen as people who bring groups of students in and out, who fill up the gift shop, who are coming to look, not necessarily coming to engage. Have you seen in your time, in this almost a decade of academic impact, have you seen attitudes changing, minds changing?
That's a very fair question, and I think it's a very regrettable transformation, because when the United Nations began, governments were fairly unsure about how this whole process of international cooperation would work, and the predecessor we had, the League of Nations, was by no means reassuring. If you look at the very first resolution of the United Nations, Resolution 1/1 as it was described, its title is "The Problems Created by the Scientific Discovery of Atomic Energy." So the very first resolution was rooted, if you will, in scholarship and academics. And if you take that a step further, today actually, March the 28th, happens to be the anniversary of the release of a report by the United States government, which is known as the Atchison-Yinelil report, I believe. It was a report which was co-authored by 4 scholars, scientists. They sat with the government, the idea being, how do we deal with atomic energy in a post-nuclear world? This was 6 months after the explosions in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And this group of governments and scholars concluded that the only way to use atomic energy was to have the entire atomic energy resources placed in the global domain, controlled by the International Atomic Energy, and a rationed amount given to each country for peaceful uses, for power or for experimentation, which could lead to the addressal of larger social ills. So that degree of involvement of the academic community, of scholarship, of scientists with the United Nations was something which was very natural in the beginning. And even when you look at the Charter of the United Nations and what it expected from the Economic and Social Council, there is this idea of constantly inviting experts, either individually or a mechanism that Jason knows well, through consultative status of non-governmental organizations. And this university was the very first university to gain that status with the Economic and Social Council. But over the years, I completely take Jason's point, and I think it's a two-way process. The United Nations has become a little more insular and clamorous because we now have 193 governments. And those 193 governments are constantly trying to debate amongst themselves what the future is. And in that space, non-government, whether it's civil society organizations, academic institutions, or the business sector for that matter, are being crowded out. But on the converse, equally, I think academic institutions and scholars tend to feel, why should we co-opt ourselves into policy making at the UN? We will do our own thing. If the UN finds our ideas are reasonable, they would enact that idea. And that is happening increasingly because virtually every United Nations resolution on the critical issues of our time, whether it is climate change and the environment, whether it is migration, whether it is human rights, all of these are informed by literature that comes from scholarship. So, specifically to answer the question, Jason, I would say yes, there is a growing distance, but I don't think it's an unbridgeable distance because where there is a need, one side reaches out to the other.
Mm-hmm. In the past, UNESCO would have been the focal point for engagement by the UN with universities, with academics, with professors, through establishing named chairs, through providing financial support in many cases for research. Is that still something that happens at the UN?
It does happen. There are UNESCO chairs in a number of countries who deal with specific sectoral ideas. But what has happened to UNESCO is that UNESCO's responsibility for the field of education itself, or the field of culture itself, the two main elements of its name, has grown so much that its terrain has narrowed really to a focus on that. So in other words, what we try to do in the academic impact if we want to build up a movement of, say, scholarship for public health or scholarship for low-cost housing, those are things which will not come within the purview of UNESCO because they don't directly relate to either education or culture. But in terms of a UN agency which works on pedagogy, it's certainly UNESCO. And beyond that, of course, as you know, we have the UN University, which is again based in Tokyo, which is a really leading research institution on key issues of the UN agenda. But again, it's an institution unto itself. It's just as FTU is. So it's not a meter of minds, so to speak.
Recently, I was reading about a new initiative that is either sponsored, organized, supported by the UN Academic Impact, and this is the Millennium Fellowship Program. I'm hoping that some of our students will take an interest in this program, which is why, well, one of the reasons why I would like you to perhaps describe that program, how it works, and what its goals are.
The Millennium Fellowship Program is a partnership that we initiated with a very active and completely young persons-driven organization based in Boston called the Millennium Campus Network. And these young people, all of them either students or recent graduates, got together, I think first about 10 or 12 years ago, and began trying to think of ways in which students could contribute to, at that time, the realization of the Millennium Development Goals, which is, as you may know, were first articulated at the turn of the century in 2000. Those goals have since yielded or been succeeded by the Sustainable Development Goals 4 years ago in 2015, and that has become the focus of this group now. The precept of the Millennium Fellowship is very simple. First of all, that a campus can provide the launching ground for initiatives which can change the world, either in terms of a practical campus activity, which then catches the imagination through social media, through the internet, through collaborative projects across countries, and becomes replicated elsewhere, or it can become the incubator of an actual idea in terms of research or scholarship. So that is the first premise. The second premise was that these sort of ideas or initiatives do not happen by accident. They need to be planned and structured, and you need a core number of individuals to be able to define that purpose. So in order to create a Millennium Fellowship program, say, as you were mentioning, Jason, on the FDU campus, you would need at least 10 students to come together and come up with a project which they intend to do. In many countries, happily not so much in the United States, those projects relate to the immediate community, where there are a number of disadvantaged sectors where students can directly help, either through practical action or through intervention with social change agencies, intervention with local government, and so on. Because most of the disadvantaged communities in other parts of the world, much of the reason why they remain disadvantaged is because of their lack of access to power. They need an interlocutor. And that is what these chapters are doing in many countries. In countries like the more developed countries, if you will, there are initiatives. The whole plastic initiative is something which you're familiar with, which is taking place all over the world. The climate initiative, which is very, very current and timely. But what we are looking for is not so much rallying around a known cause, but rallying around a known cause with a specific option or solution that is new or untested, but which could promise results. As far as I know, 30th of June this year is the deadline for the applications for the Millennium Fellowships. And, well, you already know the website for it, but please do consider applying for that.
And should students sort of gather together and come up with a concept and apply together?
Yes, yes. It should be. It should be a nucleus or network. So, in other words, a group of, say, 10 to 15 students get together saying, this is what we intend to do. This is going to be our time frame. Over the next 18 months, we would be doing this series of actions in order to come up with this one concrete result. The other point about this is that students, unlike faculty, are obviously transient. In other words, a group of students who will create a Millennium Fellowship program here in 2019 are not likely to be around on the campus in 2023. So it has to be something which really can be realized within your academic lifetime, so to speak.
Thank you. Changing direction just a little bit. You travel a great deal, and much of your travel involves visiting universities around the world, all over the world. I'm wondering if you could share with us a little bit of what you've seen over the past few years that give you hope that higher education is doing its part, and then perhaps think with me a little bit about what the challenges are, the obstacles are to higher education doing even more.
That's a fascinating question, Jason, because as you were asking me that, I realized that when I've met students in the course of the travel I've been fortunate to undertake, the higher education element doesn't really come out as something which is singular or novel or exotic. What is really very tangible is a sense of youth, of hope, and to my mind, very reassuring, a sense of faith in the possibility of an organization like the United Nations. I think young people, students, are far more optimistic about the world and willing to give the benefit of the doubt, just as they are extremely categorical about what is wrong with the world and what they will not give the benefit of the doubt to. But very often these two are congruent with each other. Just last week, I was in a university where you are known and admired and spoken very fondly of, J.F. Oberlin in Tokyo. And I met a group of students. We started an initiative when, as I mentioned, when the academic impact started with the guidance of Jason and Michael and Ambassador Kamal. We were really looking at an organization based on scholarship, faculty, research, and so on. We weren't at that time thinking so much about students. But what happened was that some colleges in the United States, their deans or provosts or presidents chose not to join the academic impact for one reason or the other. But their students wanted to be part of it, and they wrote saying, how can we be part of this process? So in typical UN fashion, we started something called ASPIRE, A-S-P-I-R-E, which stands for Action by Students to Promote Innovation and Reform Through Education. Now, this was in a sense a precursor to the Millennium Fellowships that Jason mentioned. But we have very active ASPIRE chapters in Japan, in Korea, in China, and other sort of isolated parts of the world. We have a couple in India, one in Romania, one in South Africa, a couple here in the United States. And these students whom I met from ASPIRE at the J.F. Oberlin University, I found two things about them. One is a willingness and a readiness to transcend political discomfort in the alliances they made. Now, if you look at East Asia, you have three major countries / economies in that region: Japan, South Korea, the Republic of Korea, and China. And while all of them have a very harmonious relationship, there are tensions at one level or the other, which in the past have translated to the popular level, so that there's much less people-to-people contact than one would imagine between three neighbors. These students have sought to put that behind them. The students in Japan are working with students in China, working with students in Korea, getting together, and their aims are completely modest. One is language. In other words, have Japanese students learn Korean or learn Chinese or the other way around. But the second is also to try and pool experiences. And ironically and sadly, the one experience all of them have shared has been natural or man-made disaster. We had the nuclear disaster in Fukushima in Japan 10 years ago, which is still reverberating. We've had the Sichuan earthquake in China. We've had incidents in Korea, including the major ferry accident, which completely took the entire economy by surprise because of the fragility of what was taken for granted. And students got together saying, how do we begin to prepare for this? And how do we anticipate other disasters? And it was just a question of sitting, thinking, and coming up with ideas. And a number of the ideas would have been impractical, possibly too expensive to realize. But the very fact that you're able to sit and talk about a commonality of experiences and a commonality of danger is frankly what the United Nations is all about. And the fact that they're doing this in their own time, at their age, with their academic preoccupations, I think augurs very well for the world.
And now I need to conjure up some of the difficulties and challenges. In universities around the world, there are resource challenges, not merely in developing countries, but even in developed, well-established countries. It is reasonable to ask, why should a university in South Africa, or a university in Japan, or a university in New Jersey dedicate time, energy, and resources to an endeavor that perhaps on the face of it isn't fulfilling the core mission of the institution, which is A, staying in business, and B, doing that through educational endeavors?
I really don't think there's any investment that a university needs to make, as I said, other than what it's doing already. The only investment, and this is going to be an investment of time and effort, is, as in most things, the investment of coordination. Now, take a university like FDU. I mean,
There is no university like FDU.
That's fair enough, thank you. But the entire canvas of what you do, what you teach, what you practice is so vast. How is, let's say, an innovation in the School of Nursing going to come to the attention of the world at large through the academic impact, unless there is one person at FDU who is able to get these inputs from all the colleges and faculty here and say, this is what we want to communicate. That, I agree, requires an investment, not so much of money.
It's a low sort of point of entry. Then.
Yeah, but otherwise, things are happening already. I mean, this is my point. I mean, I don't think there is a single university in the world of 2019 which is not already doing something which would be of relevance to the United Nations. But having said that, I would hope that by identifying them internationally and identifying themselves with global causes, that could be an entry for resource mobilization from areas where resources could be available, primarily the private sector. I mean, if you think of it, if a university is really going to work on low cost, not free, but low cost and plentiful energy, and find a way of getting this across, and there is a company which is willing to invest in that research in order to get the market, that is, to my mind, an advantage. It also is one of the limitations, since you mentioned hurdles or bottlenecks, in the academic impact, because the one area of tension that we have still not completely resolved is that of intellectual property. It's all very well for me to say that universities should work for the common good and so on, but let's say if a university, I mean, let's say the most obvious example, a university develops a cure for cancer, are we going to expect that university to give it to the United Nations for the global public good because of the academic impact? Or will it be commercialized through a pharmaceutical firm and then go through the entire process of democratizing it by having the prices lowered through governmental control or international sanction? So that is something which I think we have to be vigilant to and aware of.
Very interesting. The United Nations itself must generate a fair amount of intellectual property through all of its activities and undertakings. Is that intellectual property de facto in the public domain, or are there more complicated arrangements or constraints?
Well, most of the intellectual property that the United Nations generates, I think, is conceptual. It's either conceptual or it is...
it's data.
Data, statistical, exactly. So, and that's certainly in the public domain, because that's something which governments ask the United Nations to do, like the World Economic Survey or the statistical handbook on, let's say, on non-communicable diseases. Facts like
or there's a statistical handbook on tourism, exactly. Almost anything you could care to research.
Yeah.
Very good. I'd like to turn the conversation now full circle before we open up to questions. Many students come to see me and my colleagues because they get inspired and they want to know what they can do. We've heard a few things. We've heard the Millennium Fellowship. We've heard about Aspire. They also want to know about volunteering at the UN. They want to know about internships at the UN. They want to know about even possible careers for themselves in and around the UN. From your current vantage point, what sort of advice would you give to a first-year student who wants to begin to explore and begin to prepare themselves for this sort of career?
One thing I will say is that all of you who are citizens of the United States are in a unique opportunity to look for a career in the United Nations, because we have a program called the Young Professionals Program, which attracts people soon after university. They do an exam, And on the basis of that exam, much as the US Foreign Service exam or another national exam, they're admitted to work for the United Nations. Now, the number of countries who are eligible for that Young Professionals Program varies from year to year. It varies on the basis of how many nationals of that country are already working at the United Nations, what the population of the country is, what its contribution to the United Nations is. There are a whole host of factors. But the one country which is almost consistently underrepresented at the United Nations is the United States. And I imagine there are a number of reasons for this, one of which being that an American student or an American citizen has a whole array of career choices before her or him. So the United Nations would be just one of them. I mean, you'd have that, you have Pepsi-Cola, you've got academics, you've got the Red Cross, you can join what you wish. While for other countries, it becomes really a matter of life change. You're sitting in Azerbaijan and you say you want to work for the United Nations. If you're selected, there goes your life in Baku. You move to New York or Geneva or to Addis Ababa and begin a completely different set of patterns. And you don't compete with other occupational groups in those countries or in those cities. To go back to Jason's point about how you should prepare yourself, one of the remarkable things about the United Nations today is that, just as I suggested, that any academic discipline has a relevance to what the United Nations seeks to do, so too does virtually any academic discipline serve an international civil servant well. Because the United Nations is increasingly becoming a field-based organization. We've had a major overhaul in the last 12 months where we have United Nations resident coordinators, which is rather unattractive and technical term.
It's like they're running dormitories.
Exactly, yes. Sort of the resident coordinators in countries which pool together the United Nations effort, because so far we've been very fragmented. You mentioned UNESCO, UNICEF, the World Health Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization. What the current Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, believes fairly firmly, and has the advantage of having seen at first hand from his vantage point as Prime Minister of Portugal, is that if a country is to develop, and if the United Nations is to contribute to the development of that country, it has to be done in an integral rather than a sectoral fashion. But in order to have that integral fashion, you do have to have an element of the trade. So you need people who know what the contribution to development is, whether it's medicine, whether it's architecture, whether it's engineering, whatever it be. So any discipline that you are now undertaking is going to be relevant to you at the United Nations. Internships...
Even philosophy?
Even philosophy, surprisingly enough, as long as you're a liberal. But I mean, that apart. But that apart.
Who isn't?
But internships are a little more difficult, purely for the reason of physical space. The United Nations, the building is increasingly cramped. There are very few workstations. So we've had to narrow down the number of interns coming. You now have to be either enrolled in a graduate degree program or be within a year of moving to that program. We have been talking about, and I'm all for having a program of what we call off-site interns. Some people prefer to call them externs, where people work from a base other than the physical headquarters of the United Nations, but undertake specific projects. I'm all for it because I think it'll also make it much more democratic. A student, say, in India, can work for the United Nations sitting in Kerala or Delhi without having to wonder whether she or he will be able to afford living in New York for 6 months, quite apart from the cost of coming here and getting a visa to do so. So I hope we'll be able to do that, because really we need all the outside talent and skill that we get. And now, I mean, this is the whole thing. I think since the United Nations recognizes itself as a global organization, it had also best be ready to accept a global workforce where that is feasible. What was the other point you were asking about?
I have no idea.
Oh, sorry. Okay, fair enough.
Let's turn over the discussion to our audience. Ashley, do you have a microphone, or shall I give you mine? We will need to share a microphone. All right, I think I broke it, but here you go. So if you would please stand and introduce yourself and then ask your question.
Have you really developed a program for off-site interns working in different countries then, or is this just, you're just postulating?
Just postulating, but I mean, I can say that it's not just my postulation. We've been asked to, by management of the United Nations, to think of the possibility to see how it would work, where the specifics come. Do we give an intern, is it something like a term paper, say in the course of April, you will do this? Or will it be a day-to-day exercise where they work on a set of an agenda each day and report back to us? Those are the details that have to be fine-tuned.
It would be nice when it comes to fruition.
Thank you. I agree completely.
As do I.
Yeah. I mean, just to illustrate, Jason actually very kindly sent a car to pick me up from Manhattan to come here, and I couldn't locate the driver, so I called the number, and I spoke to someone in Serbia, in Belgrade, who spoke very good English, but told me that he was in Belgrade and he would get the coordinates right away, and he got the driver to speak to me. So, if that measure of technical support is globally available at hand, why should the United Nations not avail of it?
Next question, in the front row-ish. And please again, introduce yourself.
My name is Jenny Fabian. I remember you said that to be accepted as an intern, you had to be either in graduate studies or about to enroll in graduate studies. What field of study would be preferred for, what field of study for graduate studies would be preferred to go into a career in the United Nations?
It would really depend on which department or which program you're applying for. For instance, if you want to be an intern in the Department of Political Affairs, and if you have a strong academic background, let's say in Latin America or Africa or Asia, that would stand you in good stead. But my sense is that what the UN is looking for in interns is less thematic specialization, but the skills that are necessary to get the word out and to make communication easier. So in other words, people who are extremely good in technical skills on the internet, social media, who are good at putting together portfolios which can get a point across to delegations, to governments, depending on the department they're in. But obviously, if you choose the office to which you're applying with your own background, a very obvious case would be the Office of Legal Affairs. They would not really necessarily take an intern who doesn't have a law background. So those are the obvious instances. But by and large, a lot of UN departments are more general, and they're looking for those skill sets rather than an academic specialization.
Thank you. Another question? On the aisle, the young fellow in the center aisle.
As you may know, Fairleigh Dickinson has taken an early lead as far as the outreach to the United Nations is concerned. In your experience, has a majority of United States colleges or universities used this type of program? And if so, do you see a substantial difference between the, let's say, more outgoing institutions on the East and West Coast and those in the midsection of the country?
Thank you, sir. That's a fascinating point. I think, as I mentioned, Fairleigh Dickinson University pioneered the physical access of universities to the United Nations by being the first university to get consultative status with the Economic and Social Council, and also by being a leading university in the Department of Communications NG program, where Jason personally has been very active. Our common friend Shashi Tharoor, I think, once told Michael Adams, when he was talking about the university taking on NGO status, and Shashi said, Michael, I don't know what it is you want, but you can have it. You know, and that I think really sums it up, because we ourselves were not quite clear what propelled universities to do this. I mean, it was really, in this case, the personal vision and the conviction of a man like Michael Adams, backed by the formidable institution that he led. I think a lot of universities have then followed in FTU's path. We have Fordham, we've got Seton Hall, we've got Lehigh University. One thing is common to most of them, that they're all physically, to some degree or the other, accessible from the United Nations. So, as Jason said, their students can come in for programs there, they can go to the bookshop and so on. And you're quite right. I mean, the United Nations is sometimes more international than it is US-centric. I remember we did a film on the 50th anniversary of guided tours of the United Nations, and we were talking to people who had come to take a tour. And we filmed one lady and said, what do you enjoy about being at the United Nations? And she said, you know, I live 2 blocks away, but I thought I should come to the United Nations. And you'd be surprised at what strange, wonderful, and exotic people you see here. This morning I saw a lady from Kansas. So that's the sort of divide that you hit upon when you talked about the hinterland between the 2 coasts.
And of the member countries, are some more interested in the program than others?
Which program, sir? You mean the UN programs as a whole, or specifically the outreach programs?
In having an interest or an exchange of knowledge or even students between the United Nations and their own territory?
I think it really depends, unfortunately, on resources. We have a very active support from countries, again, like Japan and Korea, where students and the universities are able to financially send their students. Jason has been with students groups from both countries to the UN, but you won't find the same thing in other parts of the world where both the governments and the institutions concerned are unable to afford sending their students here. What we do in those cases is we have a very active network of UN information centers across the world. So students, say in Nigeria or Ghana, can go to the UN Information Center in Lagos or Accra and talk to UN officials, see UN products and films, and get a sense of what the organization is about. It's admittedly nowhere close to the real experience of being on 42nd and 1st, but it's our going out to them rather than expecting them to come to us.
There's a question in the last row.
Good evening, thank you for coming. My name is Lisa Lane, and I teach global issues and cross-cultural perspectives here at Fairleigh Dickinson for the past 18 years. I'm also a former U.S. diplomat, having served at the UN mission and other places. I have rather an odd question. I know that we're here for youth, or we want to inspire youth, but despite, or even though we look to what youth aspire to and their hopes and dreams for the future, I also grew up in a culture that revered their elders, that looked at elders as the vessels that held the wisdom and some of the solutions. Does the United Nations and its organizations have any connection with the elders of the world to participate in global outreach?
There are 2 elements to that. The first, and this goes right back to our subject of our conversation today. One major innovation that the Sustainable Development Goals brought in over the Millennium Development Goals was in the area of education, because the Millennium Development Goals were all about primary education, school education, and by definition, to go to your point, the right of young people to acquire an education. The Sustainable Development Goals expanded that dramatically in 2 respects. One is they brought in the right of every individual to tertiary, technical, or vocational education, including at a university. So that immediately brings you to an age group higher. But beyond that, what the Sustainable Development Goals spoke of was the importance and necessity of lifelong learning. Now, that may not seem to immediately tie in with your question about respect for the elders, but I would argue that the greatest degree of respect that you can extend is when you acknowledge that people have not gone past the capacity to do something that they could have done 50 or 60 years before. So in other words, if a person is quote unquote elder in her 70s or 80s and yet wants to acquire a skill or just knowledge, that person should have the right and be accorded the respect to do so. We also have one of the, well, I was about to say one of the oldest days, but what I mean is that one of the days that was first promulgated by the United Nations is the International Day of Older Persons, which occurs in October every year. And that is an observance which looks at, initially it used to look at old age from the traditional points of view: health, occupation, psychological factors, loneliness, absorption into society. But increasingly, it has begun also to look at them as contributing to the global workforce, particularly in areas where younger people do not have the aptitude or the energy or the will to take on certain professions, like caregiving, for instance. And that is now entirely entwined in other debates, including particularly the debate on migration. So, very simply put, I think that older people in the world are very much on the United Nations radar, not anymore as an object of sympathy or concern, but as a resource for much of what the United Nations is trying to do.
Thank you.
Very interesting. We can take, I think, one more question. And if there isn't one, I'll be forced to ask one. So consider your positions.
There's a lady there,
In
gentleman.
the background.
My name is Danny, I'm a professor here. You can hear me with the microphone.
Professor Kanicki, you have to speak into the microphone.
Okay. I would like to find out, UNESCO, I have been reading about UNESCO in Mexico. They are participating all the time with 2 universities doing research. This is one of the projects that UNESCO does all over the world. They have this kind of relationship with universities of different countries to do projects, or it's just when a government or institution offers their assistance in research. What kind of process do you do? But my question, the reason why is because many of my students or friends who are in other parts of the world, they think that the only way to get in touch with the United Nations is coming to live in New York. So this is one of the possibilities that they can be close to any organization without having to leave their country. This is my main question.
Thank you. I think the 2 universities you're mentioning are what Jason referred to earlier as UNESCO chairs. UNESCO, working with national governments and with individual universities, has established a number of chairs around the world where a professor works on a field of study which is of direct relevance to UNESCO. So certainly, I mean, studying in a university where there is a UNESCO chair gives you that tangible connection with the UN. What we've tried to do in the academic impact is to throw that much further, saying that even if your university does not have an institutional UN presence in it, like a chair, or being situated in New York near the United Nations where students can go across to the building every couple of weeks, you can still be part of the United Nations because you are identified with its mission and cause, and it's not only an identification to which you rally in support, but it's an identification which helps you to contribute to the realization of that. So whether it is through programs like the Millennium Fellowship or simply by being part of an institution that is with the academic impact, we hope you'll get that sense of, and there are, one phrase or two words that we've managed to miss in the course of our conversation: global citizenship. It's a very loaded term. It's a term that sometimes people feel is tired and has almost become cliched, but I still think it has an enormous amount of power. And strangely, the people who are most aware of it are the two spectrums which we just talked about: young people who are students and the older generation. Young people, because they're able to connect to each other globally through the net, through social media, through shared experiences, through the fact that other cultures have become so known to across their borders. And the older generation, largely because what they see as the good things of their time, literature, music, empathy, the idea of reading rather than looking at a screen, are factors which brought the world together, because literature, art, the humanities united the planet. So you have got both these spectrums, and in their own way, both fuel the purpose of the United Nations.
I'd like to challenge you on something. You didn't think you would get out of here without a fight, did you? You suggested that the term global citizen or global citizenship is loaded and possibly even tired. And I'll grant that it's old. Those philosophy students who are with us today will be familiar with the term cosmopolitan, literally being citizen of the world, of the universe. And it's a universe of people, it's a universe of places, it's also a universe of ideas. And from that point of view, I don't see how anyone could ever be tired of it. But perhaps you meant something else.
No, I meant exactly, I'm completely with you. What I meant was that some people regard it as tired, some people regard it as either politically or socially offensive because they feel it undermines patriotism or undermines nationalism. And I personally am completely with you in disagreeing with that. My only point where I would concede that it may be a little tired is if it's used as a simple catch-all. Because I think you need many caveats to the idea of global citizenship, just as I dare say you needed many caveats to the idea of being cosmopolitan. The idea being that ultimately, if you are a thinking, conscientious member of a national society, true to your own people, true to your own country, true to your own borders, you almost automatically become a global citizen if we accept the fact that each nation state is aware of its position in an interdependent world.
At FDU, we've taken to talking about responsible membership in all of the communities to which we belong.
Right.
And that could be organizational, institutional, local, national, or global.
Right.
And from a certain point of view, unless we believe that there are sort of incommensurable loyalties, that you cannot be a citizen of New Jersey and also a citizen of the United States, which some people think, then shouldn't the principles, the ethical principles governing our conduct also be the same at whatever level of community we are engaging?
Well, I would imagine, again, and please forgive me if I'm delving into uncharted philosophical territory here, but I would imagine that if you are true to yourself as a responsible human being per se, then you become, by definition, a responsible member of any association that you choose to become part of, or which accepts you as within its fold. But you also become a multiplicity of identities which don't necessarily conflict with each other. Where the problem comes, as you mentioned quite rightly, Jason, is if you exclude one identity to another. If you say, I'm not American, but I'm from New Jersey, there's obviously an element of danger there, because by saying you're not American, you're choosing to deny yourself the attributes that the United States would expect of its citizens. Or for that matter, if I say I'm from Kerala but not from India, that same thing would come here. I think that the beauty of the idea of global citizenship, or the idea of a global citizen, is that it comprehends virtually every identity you want, whether it is that of your region of domicile, the country you're from, your marital status, your parental status, your vocation, your occupation. Everything comes in and creates that globality, because the word global, as I understand it, is not restricted to geography alone. It's not just a question of being global in the sense of I can feel for the people of Bolivia. It's not that. It's an idea of sharing in the idiom that the people of Bolivia or a student in Bolivia expresses or understands. And even if you can't accept it for yourself, you at least understand it and offer something of yours in return.
Our time is running out, and we have postulated, we have proselytized to some degree.
To some degree.
We have not prognosticated, and I would not let the evening pass without some prognostication.
Please.
Where do you see the UN academic impact in 5 years? Where do you see it in 10 years?
In a sense, the chronological course that you mentioned, Jason, has been overtaken by something that you, Michael, and I did not really visualize in 2009 and 2010 when we were developing this, which is what we now call the 2030 Agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals. So to go to the specific time frame you've mentioned, we have now really a very practical set of targets that the world has set for itself. And by being so practical, each of them is amenable to scholarship, to research, to campus activity, to youth activity, and activity really lifelong across generations. So what I see 5 years from now, 2025, I would see the academic impact and members of the academic impact working to make sure that we are as close to what we want in 2030, the targets we've set for ourselves, and that we are well on the path and have contributed to that within our respective domains of expertise. Where do I see ourselves 10 years from now, when we'll be at 2030, is having a realistic, sustained, and meaningful academic input into what the post-2030 agenda will be. Because quite clearly, we will not have achieved by 2030 all that we hoped we would. By 2030, we will have a number of other forces at play that we did not anticipate in 2015. Most notably, perhaps, artificial intelligence, or a greater access or democracy of access to outer space. All these are possibilities that may occur in the next 10 years. How will it affect the lives we lead? How will it affect the life of people who are your age today, 10 years from now? What can the academic community do to define a new set of goals for, say, 2050, or for that matter, 2045, which is a more important year for us because it will mark the centenary of the United Nations. Where will we be when the United Nations is 100 years old? And will we go back to, again, to use your phrase, go back full circle, I mentioned the atomic energy idea. Will nuclear disarmament be a remote and uninteresting idea? Will the fact of nuclear power for offensive or defensive purposes be accepted but seen as something that is not a danger because no one will act? And will then the focus of the United Nations be not on collective security, but on collective progress, human development, and, yes, global citizenship?
So you're saying everything's going to be fine?
I think so, yes.
I hope all of you will join us for a dinner reception down the hall when we can continue the conversation with Ramu. And I would be remiss if I did not provide an acronym for the occasion. Realizing Academic Magic at the UN.
Wow, thank you.
Thank you all, and join me in thanking Ramu Damodaran.